Sometimes I ask myself, what is more dangerous, conscious evil or unconscious stupidity? Because there is something deeply disturbing about seeing intelligent, well-meaning people make catastrophic mistakes, not out of malice, but because they have stopped thinking, not because they lack intelligence, but because their critical spirit has been lulled to sleep. And this is where Dietrich Bonhoeffer's reflection becomes uncomfortable, urgent, and frighteningly relevant. He did not see stupidity as a simple absence of intelligence, but as an active, almost parasitic force that can take hold of brilliant minds and turn them into instruments of destruction. And perhaps most disturbing is the realization that this force does not choose only others, it lurks within each of us. Because at some point, we have all believed in something just because everyone around us believed it too. We have all remained silent so as not to go against the tide. Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran theologian who lived and died resisting the Nazi regime, did not develop his ideas in a comfortable office, but in a cold cell awaiting execution. There he wrote that stupidity is more dangerous than evil. Evil can be confronted, unmasked, resisted. Stupidity cannot. Because it acts with the conviction that it is doing good, it becomes immune to criticism, impervious to reason. And he was not talking about ignorant or uneducated people. Quite the contrary. They were doctors, teachers, religious leaders, educated people who adhered to brutal ideologies with the serenity of those who believe they are doing the right thing. Bonhoeffer saw an entire society surrendering, not because of a lack of information, but because of a surrender of thought. Decades later, science confirmed what he had already intuited. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment at Yale University to investigate the extent of human obedience. Ordinary people were instructed to apply electric shocks to other participants whenever they gave the wrong answer. Most, under the authority of a man in a white coat, followed orders to the end, even when they heard screams of pain, even when they believed they were killing someone. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who, for a few moments, gave up their conscience. And that's where the question that keeps me awake at night begins. If even the most intelligent can be taken over by this force, what prevents us from falling into the same abyss? Bonhoeffer did not limit himself to denouncing what he saw. He tried to understand it. In his letters from prison, he wrote that stupidity is not so much an intellectual defect as a moral and social failure. It is not something that comes from a limited mind, but from a mind that refuses to think for itself. That allows itself to be captured by slogans, empty words, ideas repeated until they become dogma. When talking to a stupid person, he wrote, one has the feeling that one is not dealing with a human being, but with something that dominates him. This analysis is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to recognize that we are not dealing with a problem of IQ or education. We are talking about something much more subtle and devastating, the renunciation of intellectual autonomy. And this renunciation almost always comes with other things. It is cultivated by an environment that makes it convenient, that rewards superficial thinking, that penalizes doubt and complexity. We live in a world that pressures us to be fast, productive, reactive. Deep reflection has become a luxury. Social media, with its algorithms that reward emotional engagement, trains us to react rather than think. Headlines scream, feeds scroll. Life demands immediate responses. And in the midst of this whirlwind, thinking becomes an effort, a resistance, a difficult choice. Bonhoeffer saw this beginning to happen in his time, but he could not have imagined the scale it would take. Today, there is no need to suppress information. Just make it confusing, incessant, emotionally manipulative. Just overload us. When we are exhausted, insecure, and overwhelmed, independent thinking is the first to succumb. We become easy prey for any narrative that offers us simplicity instead of nuance, certainty instead of doubt, comfort instead of truth. The modern economy also pushes us in this direction. When someone works 2 jobs, is in debt, and worried about rent, there's little energy left to examine complex ideas. And so, as an almost instinctive defense, what economists call rational ignorance emerges. The unconscious decision not to want to know, because knowing requires more than one can give. And here's the tragic irony. While the world demands that we be productive, it quietly undermines our ability to discern. What Bonhoeffer called functional stupidity is, in large part, a consequence of the environment we have created for ourselves. An environment that rewards noise over reason, speed over wisdom, certainty over curiosity. But Bonhoeffer went further. He identified that this phenomenon, this intellectual surrender, does not happen in isolation. It thrives, above all, in collective environments. Stupidity, he wrote, is not a psychological defect, but a sociological problem. This means that it grows stronger when we cease to be thinking individuals and start functioning as parts of a group that thinks for us. History is full of examples. The Salem witch trials, McCarthyism in the United States, collective hysteria in the face of invented or amplified crises. These were not caused by evil people, but by ordinary people who were convinced they were doing the right thing. They were driven by fear, a sense of belonging, and simplified narratives that offered emotional security, and most dangerously, convinced that they no longer needed to think for themselves. Milgram and Asch demonstrated this empirically in his famous experiment in the 1950s. When placed in a room with other people giving obviously wrong answers, most participants yielded to group pressure and agreed with the error, even though they knew it was wrong. It's disconcerting, but deeply revealing. Conformity, even in simple things, has a silent power to shape our perception of reality. Now imagine this mechanism on a global scale, amplified by social networks that operate with surgical precision to reinforce our pre-existing beliefs. The algorithm doesn't want us to think. It wants us to react. And worse, it shows us only what confirms our worldview, lulling us into a false sense of consensus. The feed you see is not the same as someone else's. It's tailored to you based on everything you've ever believed. It's a self-reinforcing bubble. And when you share false information, even innocently, because it confirms what you already think, you become part of that cycle. A cycle that rewards simplification, emotional certainty, indignation. Because all of this generates clicks, it generates profit. And the more we react without thinking, the more we strengthen a system that profits from our ignorance. It's the architecture of ignorance. And it works because it's comfortable, because real thinking hurts. It takes time, energy, and a willingness to confront your own fallibility. It requires humility, and sometimes it takes courage to go against the group, even those we love most. Bonhoeffer called this costly grace, the price you pay for thinking independently, especially when everything around you demands conformity. It is not a heroic virtue, it is a daily practice. Choosing to question when everyone else is shouting answers. Choosing to doubt when everyone else has already made up their minds. Choosing to look twice when the answer seems too easy. This daily choice, to think even when it's easier to go with the flow, is what separates us from intellectual surrender. And like any exercise, it takes practice. That's why we need to cultivate habits, that strengthen our minds in the face of the silent pressures of the modern world. The first practice is what I call intellectual friction. It's a commitment to read or listen to someone who thinks differently from us at least once a week, not necessarily to change our minds, but to test whether our convictions survive honest scrutiny. This is harder than it sounds, because the human brain has a natural tendency to reject information that challenges its beliefs, a cognitive bias called cognitive dissonance. But it is precisely by resisting this impulse that we become intellectually stronger. The second practice is cultivating productive ignorance. This means accepting that we don't know everything, and that this is not a flaw, but a virtue. Ask yourself, what evidence would make me change my mind? If you can't answer, you may not have a belief. You have a prison. The third is perhaps the simplest and most powerful. Slow down. Before sharing information, before reacting impulsively, pause for 60 seconds. Check the source. Reflect on the impact of what you are about to say or spread. A minute of silence can break an entire cycle of misinformation. And finally, the most subversive practice of all, say, I don't know. In an age of absolute certainties and shouted opinions, admitting ignorance is a revolutionary act. Because where there is room for doubt, there is room for growth. But let's be honest, individual practices are not enough. We are fighting against entire systems designed to keep us distracted, divided, and emotionally manipulable. Social networks that profit from polarization, platforms that amplify noise, politicians who win elections with empty slogans, not well thought out ideas, companies that thrive on our exhaustion and our haste. If we want to truly resist, we need structural change. We need to demand transparency from the algorithms that shape what we see. We need critical education from an early age, teaching us to identify reliable sources, evaluate arguments, and think rigorously. We need platforms that value honest doubt over aggressive certainty. And above all, we need a world where thinking is not a luxury, but a real possibility. Because when people live less stressed, less in debt, less overwhelmed by daily worries, there is more room to reflect. And that space, that little pause between stimulus and response, can be the difference between repeating a historical mistake or choosing a new path. And that is where Bonhoeffer's warning becomes even more urgent, because we no longer face only human manipulation. We now deal with machines that learn, algorithms that anticipate our reactions, artificial intelligence systems trained to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Every click, every pause, every hesitation is analyzed and used against our mental autonomy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw this in action with disturbing clarity. People with years of education, doctors, engineers, university professors, began sharing conspiracy theories, denying scientific evidence, trusting unfounded cures. The problem there was not a lack of intelligence, but a collapse of discernment in the face of massive emotional pressure, widespread fear, and an avalanche of contradictory information. Bonhoeffer paid with his life for maintaining his intellectual independence. He refused to give in, even though he knew the price would be high. On April 9, 1945, he was hanged, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His last words, according to a fellow prisoner, were, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." This phrase is not just a farewell, it is an ethical and existential statement. Bonhoeffer understood that thinking courageously is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a way of living with dignity. He understood that when we give up thinking, judging, and discerning, we cease to be fully human. We become puppets, manipulable, reduced to vehicles of the strongest wills of the moment. And today, that risk is even greater, because the strings that pull us are no longer visible. They do not come from charismatic leaders or totalitarian regimes, but from bright screens and user-friendly interfaces. It is the recommended videos, the personalized feeds, the deepfakes that blur the line between reality and illusion. We live in an age where truth itself is editable, and this forces us to face the question Bonhoeffer left us. When thinking becomes dangerous, expensive, or inconvenient, who keeps thinking? The answer does not lie in intelligence or academic training. It lies in something much more subtle, in the daily choice to remain curious, to seek the truth, to accept the discomfort that comes with doubt. It's not about heroic acts. It's about small acts of resistance, choosing silence over reaction, questioning over blind adherence, study over repetition. The tragedy of functional stupidity is that it presents itself as relief. Thinking is painful. It requires energy, time, effort. Keeping contradictory ideas in mind without giving into an easy answer is a constant challenge. But Bonhoeffer reminds us, this discomfort is the price of remaining human. What perhaps frightens us most is not the presence of functional stupidity around us, but the fact that it also dwells within us. The moment we believe we are immune to it, we begin to fall into its trap. Bonhoeffer did not write his theory to comfort us, but to warn us. He understood that intellectual freedom is not a destination, but a constant vigilance. Not against external enemies, but against our own desire to stop thinking when thinking becomes uncomfortable. The problem has never been that people have become less intelligent. The problem is that the systems around us have come to reward mental shortcuts, emotional reactions, and immediate certainty. But within this harsh diagnosis, there is real hope. Because if stupidity is, in part, a choice, it can also be rejected. If it is structural, structures can be challenged. And if it is fueled by overload, then we can, together, create conditions to alleviate that burden. Thinking critically is like training a muscle. At first it hurts. It's easier to stay where you are, repeat what you hear, confirm what you already believe. But over time, this practice strengthens. Just as you can't run a marathon without training, you can't navigate the complexity of the modern world without constant intellectual exercise. So here's an invitation. This week, choose a belief that you hold with conviction. And for 30 minutes, just 30, research the best arguments against it. Not to torture yourself, nor to convince yourself otherwise, but to practice the courage that Bonhoeffer lived until the end. If your belief survives, it will emerge stronger. If it doesn't, you will have taken a step toward the truth. Believe me, if this video made you doubt something you were sure of, that's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intellectual courage. And in a world designed to keep us passive, the simple act of thinking for oneself has become one of the most powerful forms of resistance. Now, if you've made it this far, it's because this has touched you in some way. And I need to ask you something. Today, YouTube's algorithm has changed. It no longer delivers this type of content easily. You need to interact, liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel so that this video reaches more people who, like you, may need this message. And if you feel that this work has value, please consider leaving a donation. Any amount makes a huge difference. That's what keeps this channel alive, this space for thought, reflection, and resistance. It's not just about keeping videos online. It's about keeping a flame of humanity burning in dark times. Because every time someone chooses curiosity over certainty, thought over repetition, truth over comfort, something in all of us grows stronger. Thank you for being here. Thank you for thinking, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for supporting this mission.